great to have you join us today for what is bound to be an exciting conversation, given the people that we have assembled in our panel today. So we have Stephen Hunwicks, who is a special counsel at HopgoodGanim Lawyers. We have Jess Walker, the founder of Holocron Cyber, Mike Auerkirk, founder of WebSafe Staff, and Alexei Dudkin, a co-founder of Volcus. So what you'll be hearing about today is, I guess, some of the more relevant and salient points about cybersecurity, which is a constant and ever-present threat in the world that we live in, unfortunately. But there are some things that we can do to improve our exposure and our risk profile. So you'll hear things about what are the legal implications and the cost of data breaches. You'll hear an interesting bit of information about protecting sensitive data from data breaches and what actually constitutes sensitive data and how easy is it to get a data breach to occur or to be prevented. We'll talk about the importance of security awareness training and helping people understand that it's everybody's business to manage cybersecurity, not just the IT department. And we'll talk about why companies should regularly have their systems tested both internally and externally. So with that as our introduction, let me introduce you a little more in depth to Stephen Hunwicks from HopgoodGanim. Stephen is a privacy and cybersecurity lawyer, and he advises Australian businesses, government agencies, not-for-profits on privacy, cybersecurity, including data breach resilience and incident response, IT contracting, and intellectual property protection and commercialisation. Before he started practicing law, Steve worked in a product development and marketing role for mobile and fixed line broadband services, and also as a security software vendor. So thank you for joining us today, and let me introduce you to Steve.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Joel. I appreciate the intro, and I'm probably dating myself by referring to my background in before becoming a lawyer, but it was excellent and practical training for my current role, assisting businesses who work in the tech space. So I was pleased to have those 10 years before studying law. As we kick off this morning, I thought I would just put it in these first couple of slides, just not to scare people. I just want to set the context that we're operating in. And think about, what are some of the challenges we face in trying to protect information, our systems, and also information that we hold in our businesses. If we look outside of our businesses, we're going to see that both personally and professionally, identities are under siege. There's information being collected from any number of sources. And the information that we tend to collect in our businesses are some of our most valuable assets. They're the things we trade off. It's partly reputation, but partly the data that we hold. That also makes businesses pretty big targets for ransomware and extortion attacks, identity theft. As holders of businesses, as holders of information, businesses are targets. It's probably unlikely that somebody's going out targeting your business per se, but just businesses being holders of data make them targets. It's really the vulnerability that carries through to create the risk in business. So we're going to talk today about how to manage that risk and reduce our attack surface. Some of the baddies out there that are throwing things at us are throwing phishing attacks, email compromise, crypto mining, malware, DDoS attacks. The list goes on. You've probably heard a lot of the phrases for things. I see 6 or 7 of these every day in our business, and we help our clients to manage and protect those risks, both on the preparation side and on the response side. And that's really the message I want to leave you with today, that there are ways to prepare and ways to successfully respond, so that if the proverbial has hit the fan, you can actually have a resilient business and respond to the incident in a responsible way that protects trust with your customers. I just wanted to talk briefly about this interplay between confidential information and private information or personal information. Concepts like confidentiality apply to secret information that is protected within our business, as opposed to personal information, which is protected by privacy law. The confidentiality obligations can arise because of our relationship with another business or a customer, or because of the sort of legal and equitable relationship that we have as the holder of that information. But confidential information can include trade secrets and things that aren't personal information. They're just important or key data that we hold in our business. That's distinct from, but overlaps with, private information. Personal information that is unique to an individual is about them. And some of our business obligations are related to privacy compliance rather than strategically protecting confidential business information. But there's an interplay and an overlap between these concepts. So we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail today. Without going into the detail of any of these legal frameworks, I just want to point out that businesses have a range of information privacy, confidentiality, and data protection obligations, and they come at us from a variety of legal laws, legal relationships, contracts, and duties that we have as business owners. So, for example, the Privacy Act, the state-based equivalents like the Information Privacy Act here in Queensland. There are contracts that we sign up to with our customers that can require us to hold information in a particular way. If you're the director in a business, you've got duties under the Corporations Act to act with care and diligence, and that applies also to how we run our business and how we hold information within that business. And there's other more specific laws like the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act that's recently come into play in 11 critical industry sectors. I did mention directors' duties in cybersecurity. So without looking at any particular law, directors of a business have the obligation to manage cybersecurity risk within the business. And we see today that the cyber risks are the #1 risk facing any business. Setting aside anything else, cyber seems to rise right to the top, and it's the one we're talking about most today. If we've had the unfortunate occurrence of a data incident, you might tend to think about the costs of that incident coming up in the context of the immediate response and the aftermath. But those costs actually have a range of size and shapes, and some of them don't come up until 18 months down the track. But I've put on the slide there a few of the themes under which costs can arise. So it's not just the data compromise; it's the loss of trust, the loss of business, the downtime, reputational damage, the legal costs of recovering, the loss of business connections and trust, as I say. Having to give notice to individuals if there has been a breach that affects their personal information. The numbers vary, but the costs of a data incident, been estimated by companies such as IBM to be upwards of $5 million per incident. So we're not talking insignificant levels of cost for any business. This is just a visual representation of some of the life cycle that we tend to help clients through if there has been an incident. The general themes are first, raise the flag, sound the alarm, get some help. Those helpers come from a range of industry backgrounds. They could be some of us on the call as legal advisors, as cyber forensic analysts, as your outsourced technology team. We can all team together to help you respond, contain, assess, and react to that data incident. Under the Privacy Act, there are data breach notification requirements so that if the exposure of personal information means that there's a risk to individuals, you may have to notify them. We help you through that process. And then like at the end of every good response, we'll try to ensure that same type of incident doesn't happen again by looking at root causes, prevention, and remediation. I'd like to leave you with a few questions to think about. These are general, but they seem to apply to most businesses. Think about what is the technical risk to the business from potential cybersecurity incidents. Where are they likely to come from? Are they internal or are they external? thinking about those risks, then what can we do to temper the risk or damage resulting from any of those risks actually happening or coming to fruition? A question that my clients are often thinking about is, what does a successful recovery and response look like? And keeping that end goal in mind really informs the investment they want to make in the response and the remediation action plan. Lastly, think not just about your business, but the upstream or the downstream effects of data of security incidents that affect your business. We've seen a number of incidents in the last few weeks that have talked about suppliers to the business. And sometimes you are the supplier to another business. So if a data breach affects you, how might it affect your customers as well? Terrific. And then just some reduction strategies there, doing that risk assessment, establishing a framework, reducing the footprint or the amount of information that you hold. We like to add layers or doors that protect against phishing attacks, or we use multi-factor authentication to keep the baddies out. We'll talk later in the session about training and how awareness can help to reduce that risk as well. And you can also do vendor assessments. So when starting to work with an organization, think about asking about their security arrangements and how they might dovetail or interplay with your own.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. If you wanted to make contact with Stephen, there's some contact details here for him. Just giving those that are on the call with us now today an opportunity to put a question forward if you want to. You can either put in the chat or you can unmute yourself and make a comment there. Happy for that to happen if there's a question that anyone would like to ask of Stephen. Just to get things going while people are thinking, perhaps, Stephen, is there, if businesses have to collect data for all sorts of reasons, but sometimes, or most of the time, it has a shelf life. What happens if they keep it longer than the shelf life? Because obviously that could happen quite easily, I'd imagine. Is there a cost to that from them, for them doing that, or is there additional risk that's associated with them doing that?
There is, yeah. Thank you, Joel. That's a great question. We find there's a range of maturity in business around only holding information for as long as we needed to have it collected and held. Unfortunately, we recently helped a wealth advisor business respond to a data breach incident, and frankly, they were holding data, they were hoarding data, if I can use that term, for more than 20 years. So when clients had left, they had retained the data about all of those clients and accounts, really because there was a risk that ASIC might, as the regulator, might come along and ask for reports based on aggregate information. So they were holding it because ASIC a few years ago, if we think back, had that future of financial advice review that was sort of in the tax and wealth advisor space. But the process, and ASIC at that time asked for 10 years worth of information. So although businesses might have only kept that data for 5 or 7 years, the fact that ASIC was going back further had led this client to think we need to retain the data longer. And it was cheap to hold, right? Because it was just on electronic media. They were scanned copies of documents. But when a data breach occurred, that client now had to notify clients back 20 years ago. In the last couple of months, that client has notified clients that haven't been clients for 15 or 20 years. And that had an extra cost to the tune of a six-digit number. So it was more than $180,000 in additional cost to notify those extra individuals. So yes, it does carry a very real and practical impact. No
doubt there would be reputational damage there because people thought, why have you still got my data after 15 or 20 years of me not being a client anymore? Interesting case.
If we looked at those, the queries that came in after that incident, 49 out of 50 questions were basically, why did you keep my data for so long? It was certainly a mismatch between the expectations of the customer and what the business was doing in practice. Yeah.
Great. Well, good. Thank you for that interesting information. Let's move now to.
I had a question actually, if I could. On what about the other side of the coin? So if you're a consumer, do you have any power to not give out information, or do you have any power to force businesses to delete your data?
That's a good question, Alexei. Under the current state of the Australian privacy law, you don't have some of those rights that you do, for example, if you're a European citizen under the GDPR. So if you're familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU or the UK, it has extra, they're called data subject rights, but there's these extra rights like the right to be forgotten. And you can actually go to the holder of your information and ask them to stop processing the information and to delete it. We don't have those enshrined rights under the Australian law, but there's some recent privacy amendment proposals that, you know, if those get picked up by government and enacted, that would give those same rights to Australian consumers.
Okay.
Having said all that, lots of businesses will take some steps to anonymize or de-identify your information. So it's best, I would say, ask them. The worst they can say is, we don't have the capability to do that.
Yeah.
But then as a practical tip, I'd also just say that you don't necessarily have to give them correct information either. You know, for example, if I just take my Go card as an example, I don't use my real birthday on my Go card profile, even though for whatever reason they require a birthday to be on there. So you can do things practically as a consumer to help protect against issues that affect your suppliers. Good question.
Right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. We do have a compressed time frame, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Although we spend a long time talking about all those things. Very interesting. So let's move now to Jess Walker, the founder of Holocron Cyber. He understands the critical role information systems play in businesses today, and he has a career that has included supporting critical IT infrastructure in the public, private, and the medical sectors. And he currently spends time advising executive teams and boards on how to implement effective cybersecurity strategy and frameworks to better equip their internal teams and protect sensitive data. So welcome, Jess. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel, and appreciate the introduction, and also appreciate Steve's thoughts around cyber incidents. I guess, you know, the panel today is made up of security experts, and we're all attacking and approaching security on different fronts. I guess really, you know, moving on from or expanding upon cyber incidents is I really just want to dive into some of the main cyber incidents you know, we in particular are seeing within our organisation amongst our clients. And I guess the trends we're seeing year over year are threats are increasing, that they're not going down. And I'd say business email compromise is one area which a lot of companies are having difficulty getting on top of. I'd say with the rise and advent of these AI products, you know, such as ChatGPT, the scams that are coming through now. A few years ago, you could tell what these looked like straight off the bat because, you know, the English was poorly worded in the email. You know, it was impersonal. Now, with these AI platforms, you know, these countries where generally these schemes come from, where English isn't the first language, are now using these platforms to essentially generate these emails. So it's going to become harder and harder to differentiate business email compromise, especially spear phishing campaigns that come from or purport to come from a legitimate source, you know, such as upper management within an organisation. I think the interesting thing here is, you know, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, each year they release threat reports. Now, last year around business email compromise, they estimate it's costing businesses $64,000, and I'd say that's on the lower end. Again, with what Steve was saying, is that for staff clicking on links or replying to these business email compromises, it's costing businesses a lot of money. I guess that, you know, the other area that we're seeing a lot of activity around, and, you know, you would have seen this in the news with the high profile data breaches, you know, the Medibank, Optus, is the extortion or ransomware events, and essentially ransomware is a type of or form of malware. Now, ransomware isn't new. I think I probably saw the first case of it here over 10 years ago in Australia with a client that we were working with at the time. And, you know, they were extorted for cryptocurrency, which is generally the means that they use as forms of payment for ransomware. But obviously it wasn't as prevalent in value as it is today. So that payment, and I've been involved in quite a few cases, have been anywhere up to $500,000. And for a small business, that is a significant cost. So I guess, you know, when we're talking about ways that, you know, we can protect ourselves from business email compromise, from malware, ransomware in particular, email protection, you know, using mail filtering services. I think Mike's on the call today. He'll talk around training. I wouldn't say there is one particular solution that will prevent you on all fronts, but it's essentially having a number of arrows in your quiver that you can essentially arm the organization with. Moving on to insider threats. I think, again, along with this, the theme of cyber incidents and data breaches, is all data breaches are caused either through negligence or, you know, they can be intentional, but they all have the same resonance in that they cost businesses downtime and money. And I've listed some examples up here about different insider threats. Look, I've heard and seen examples in, you know, Europe and the US where staff actually are hired internally to leave their organization momentarily and cause damage to competitors. Not so much here in Australia. I'd say compromised employees and social engineering in that sense are general ways that they tend to find themselves in and attacking businesses. I think, you know, at the end of the day, with any cyber incident, it's the cost of downtime and reputable damage. So when we talk about protection from insider threats, really it comes down to having really strict and stringent onboarding and offboarding processes for employees. You certainly don't want to have staff who've left 6 months ago still with access to your core systems. So moving on, you know, another way we help and protect businesses is through security operations centers. Now, these essentially sit on top of or beside your organization. And it's a team of security experts that essentially have eyes on glass to key incidents as they're coming into your organization and are able to report and protect you from those threat actors. Now, generally speaking, you know, a security operations center is a lot of work. It takes, you know, a lot of time and it can be costly. But for the bigger end of town, I was just speaking to another provider last week who's assisting Optus with a lot of their incident response exercises on the back of their data breach. And, you know, Optus is spending millions of dollars on their security operations center as a result. So I guess, you know, the security operations centers make sense for some businesses, not all, but certainly making sure that we put in place those key items to help us become more resilient. Moving on to security governance. So again, if we talk about insider threats, really good security governance are ways in which you can better protect and better safeguard that data within your business. Now, good governance starts from the top. I work with a lot of executives, and you know, you need buy-in by the management. If the board or the executive team aren't on board, then you can't expect you know, your staff to be able to be proactive when it comes to executing a lot of what's contained in these documents and policies. And I've listed off just some key examples of policies that you should have at a minimum within your organisation, just to again help ensure that you're safeguarding your data. This is probably, you know, a key area that we're seeing a lot of traction and movement in, and one I would say a lot of the big companies, especially those in the news recently, have failed, is that they don't, or they either have disaster recovery and cyber incident response plans, but they're not simulating them. They're not reviewing them regularly. So when a real world incident comes along, they fall over because, you know, it's outdated, or they just haven't updated it to include, you know, a cyber incident response team that is able to execute the plan. So really, I think crisis simulation is a key aspect once you have these plans, is essentially putting into practice what you have on paper. Again, running these with the executive is where we find a lot of buy-in, and again, it adds value to the board. The board can then see that the organisation is resilient, and they can then report it back to, you know, their insurance bodies and also to their key partners to say and prove that they're a resilient organisation.
Great. Thank you, Jess. I appreciate that. We've got some contact details for Jess there. If you want to make contact with him later on, you're welcome to do that. Any questions from the people on the call for Jess? Happy to take a question in the chat, or if you unmute yourself, we'd be happy to have that conversation. While that's happening, perhaps let me just ask you a question. You mentioned email threats, and I personally have had some email threats sent to me in all sorts of different organizations that I've worked in, and in my personal emails. But why is that such an effective method? Why do you think that is the go-to method, perhaps, if you like?
Look, I think, you know, again, as we've become more reliant on email, you know, there's an emotional factor to it as well. And I think, you know, we see an email come through and it may say, you know, free airline tickets, or, you know, here's your gift card. And again, if we look at these threats, you know, through the lens of an attacker, they're wanting to mimic real world scenarios. So again, you know, Telstra has got a big issue at the moment of threat actors lifting, you know, logos, copies of their invoices to essentially mimic real world invoices. So again, if you think of the communication channels, everyone has an email account, whether it's, you know, personal or work. And again, in a digital world where it's hard to determine sometimes what's real and what's not real, again, emails are a great medium for that to take place.
And a lot of people get a lot of email too, and so
definitely,
you don't spend the time individually on one just to go, oh, is that a real one or is that a fake one? And so perhaps the expediency of just dealing with something quickly because you see it needs dealing with, that perhaps can play into it as well.
Yeah, you know, there was one of our clients, you know, they had an email come through to 5 different staff, and it was from the CEO asking them to urgently go down to the 7-Eleven and purchase gift cards. Now, those staff combined ended up spending close to $5,000 on iTunes gift cards, and, you know, knocked on the door of the CEO and said, here's your gift cards. And again, you know, going back to the training element and the process, it's continual. You can't rest on your laurels here, especially with these different cyber threats.
Well, interesting segue then about training staff. So let's introduce Mike Auerkirk, the founder of WebSafe Staff. He has more than 25 years of experience in the IT sector, working across the world in the UK, in New Zealand, Australia, and he's identified that most IT security issues were caused through a lack of knowledge and education. So those points that we've already heard. So this led him to realise that establishing an IT or cybersecurity awareness program would be a valuable thing for organisations. That's what he now delivers throughout Australia to SMEs as well as to large organisations. So Mike, welcome along. Thank you for being on our panel today.
Hi Joel, thanks for the intro. Very good. Yeah, and just if anyone's wondering, that's not actually me on the screen. That's just a confused man. So I've got a few animations here, Joel, so maybe watch my finger, and if I do that, just click through. Is that cool? Yep. Look, click through now, basically. Human nature is essentially, we're quite trusting and maybe a bit naive and helpful and even gullible to a certain degree. That's how we used to be, especially 20 years ago, and that was kind of okay back then. But these days, these sorts of traits get us into a whole heap of doo-doo, so we don't want to do that anymore. It's still good to be a nice person and be helpful, but we want to temper that with a little bit of suspicion, right? Because, geez, we're being targeted pretty heavily. Next. There are, broadly speaking, 3 parts to the IT security chain, and you've got people, processes, and technology. And the guys have spoken quite a lot about this stuff already. We've got the tech, we've got the processes, and we've got the people. And this is the general viewpoint when people talk about the technology side of things, is that people are the weakest link. You hear this stuff, and I hear it a lot, stupid users and that sort of stuff. Biggest risk is a common thing that I hear. People are the biggest risk. Now, look, for me, a risk is composed of a threat and a vulnerability. The threat are the crims, the people are the vulnerability. So they're not the risk, they're the vulnerability. They're vulnerable because they don't know how to spot the scams. So that's how this stuff works for me. I'm never going to call them the biggest risk. To change that, what can we do? Start off with the mindset. And look, it's been mentioned, start at the top, right? You want to basically say people are not our weakest link, they're the biggest asset. Management must know that. They must understand that people can be a massive deal when you're fighting the cybercrimes, because like 82% of breaches have a person element in there. So it's a big deal. They're heavily targeted. Start off. It's a program of change, right? We're gonna use people. They're our biggest asset. You don't tell people they suck and then expect them to change. It kind of doesn't work that well. So certainly start with the mindset. Fire away, Joel. Next one. Buy-in. So buy-in is the next one. Something I realized is people don't, maybe I didn't realize it, maybe a change management person did, but people don't like to change unless they're dissatisfied. So when you get around to the cybersecurity stuff and you say, we're going to get hacked, people go, I don't care. IT's got that sorted, the tech people can look after that. Oh, just go back a bit. The tech people can look after that. Well, no, it is everyone's responsibility now because of how heavily people are targeted. So before you get started on the stuff, you need people to realize that they are the solution, and they need to care. And I think it's a fairly hefty thing to relate this stuff to home use. So a lot of what I teach is actually home-based stuff, and that just gets people dissatisfied, like, oh no, I'm going to lose my money, or not my daughter's going to get bundled into a van or anything, but maybe their identity get stolen, or take photos and do deep fakes and things like that. So buy-in is massive. And if you are telling people, hey, we're going to do cybersecurity awareness training, you do not want this. You don't want someone to go, yeah, that's cool, and then the general response is, nah, I'm going to pass on that, right? That's not a good response. So you do want people excited about it, get them excited about it. And people, when they buy into it and they do it, they should go away and talk about this stuff, right? It should be conversation topics. Okay. Then we get into actually training people. And this is a big chunk of what I do. I will say anything is better than nothing. The online computer-based training, generally I would consider that more compliance-based, like tick a box. Yeah, we did it. Now we can get our insurance and that sort of stuff. The challenge will be a lot of people will just click through next, and not actually engage with it. So if you're going to do training, do note, if you're going to do compliance-based stuff, yeah, you tick a box, but you might not be getting rid of the risk. So moving up from that, there's people like me that do live training because people can share stories and they can ask questions, and that generally goes quite well. Anything's better than nothing, right? So at least do that. Next one. From there, look, so awareness training, you start with that should change people's behavior, and from there you want to get into cultural change. So essentially what this means is you develop a culture of cybersecurity awareness. So people are constantly thinking about this stuff. They're quite suspicious. They're well informed. You're measuring things, how well you're doing. You're looking for continuous improvement. So that's cool. There are frameworks for this stuff. You don't have to get that complicated. Like, really talk about stuff at staff meetings. Hey guys, do you remember this? Or check out this scam. Just keep it front of mind for people. So do that. A minute a week, that's nothing, right? But there's big gains to be had with that, just building a culture around this stuff. And you can even, and companies can get like ambassadors, like we're going to get 5 people in different departments and we're going to train them up, and you can go and ask them stuff. So lots of ways of doing this stuff, but just keep it going in small bite-sized chunks and support people and keep it very nurturing and encouraging. And I think last slide, in essence, the core of this stuff is get people to stop and think before they act. And it's been mentioned, like the crims, they want us to act before people think about it. So they do emotive stuff like scare the pants off us, or hey, here's your free lunch, right? You're going to get a free car, that sort of stuff. You want people suspicious. You want them just thinking about stuff. Suspicion, like I actually call my training suspicion training a lot of the time, because you don't have to know all this stuff, but if you are suspicious, then you're going to think, and if you don't know what to do, you're going to ask for help. That's cool. I suppose to the better one. So get people suspicious, get them engaged, scare the pants off. And if you go to with the training, it's usually what happens when I train people. But yeah, it's not that hard. So do something. It's a good way to stop the crims. And of course, it's not the be all and end all. You've got to do everything. People, process, technology, do it all if you've got a weak point. That's me.
Great. Thank you for that. That's interesting. And I agree. I've been doing training a lot myself over the years for different organizations. And definitely the face-to-face training has a far greater impact than the online training in terms of people's ability to retain, as well as their engagement with the content. So it's a useful thing. So appreciate that, and good luck with those. Any questions for Mike before we move on to Alexi? Ooh. All right, we're on the clock here, so I'm going to transition to Alexi now and let you talk about penetration testing. So Alexi is, as I said before, the founder or co-founder of Volcus, and he's a penetration tester, a hacker, a good one, a white hat, I think we call that instead of a black hat, perhaps, and a security consultant with a decade of experience in building security systems and providing bespoke security consultancy with empathy. So he's worked to build and lead multiple teams and service offerings, including penetration testing, security consulting, IR, and security training. So welcome, Alexi. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, white hat, black hat, pink hat. What are we? We're in the week of Barbie this week. Pink hat. Yeah, hacking is, for me, hacking's not a dirty word. Hacking is just a skill, just like cooking, right? You can use your knives to stab people. You can use hacking to cause cyber crimes, make people's lives hell, or you can do it for good, like how we do it, basically. Yeah, my name is Alexi. That's Skorov in most places. I have to have a hacker alias, otherwise I'm not allowed to do this basically. Skorov8 on Twitter. I like hacking, especially Active Directory, but a whole bunch of other stuff. Co-founder of Volcus. I like climbing things, mostly rock climbing, but sometimes trees. I like to ruin cars. It's probably similar with hacking. I like to slap big turbos on cars and make them go real fast. I love dogs, especially that one. That's my boy there.
Right.
So today, what is penetration testing? Why even think about doing it? That little GIF there is probably not penetration testing, so we can go next slide. Basically, a penetration test is an exercise of hacking your organization. You get a consultant in, someone with some hacking experience, they go ahead and do very much the similar techniques that real attackers and bad guys will use against your organization to try and find those weaknesses or vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. And so what's a vulnerability? Well, a vulnerability is basically anything that can cause a negative impact to your business. It can be some crazy technical, vulnerability in the bits and bytes of a program, or it can very simply be me calling up your help desk going, hey, I'm, Bob, I forgot my password. Could you reset it for me? And then your help desk goes ahead and resets Bob's password and then gives it to me. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be super technical, but the idea here is to find the problems before the bad guys do, and then give you recommendations for how to fix those problems so that the bad guys can't use those same loopholes. It's basically a really good way of figuring out what attackers are going to do in your network in a very quick way. Why are they important? Well, this is a very typical list of findings. This is actually from a real report that we did recently for a client. You can see there the number of high risks and medium risks and low risks. That doesn't tell you much. Some weird names of vulnerabilities, some high risks. But in this particular case, what this meant for this client was we got, with no prior access, we managed to get domain admin privileges, which is basically access to everything. We managed to steal their financial information. We managed to steal their some recipes for certain pharmaceutical drugs that they make. So pretty serious intellectual property breach there. Stuff that is sensitive to them and they wouldn't want public. If I was a bad guy, absolutely, I'd be ransoming that data, either actually doing a ransomware attack against their organization, like shutting everything down, or taking that intellectual property and going, I'm going to share this with your competitors unless you pay me $500,000. That's my retirement plan. Wait, no, did I say that? Oh crap! I wasn't supposed to say that. No, we don't do that. We don't do that. But a real attacker would probably do that. So for each of these vulnerabilities, we basically give a really quick, recommendation for how to fix it. And a lot of these are quick wins. So why I love doing penetration tests is it's a measurable increase in security after the fact. You go through these, we find them, we demonstrate what can be done, you fix them, and there's a measurable improvement. So these are the things that real attackers are going to do against you if they manage to find a way in. Next slide, please. Yep. So what's a typical internal penetration test or pen test look like? Essentially, we come up with a scope, and a scope is kind of an agreement where you tell us, hey, you're allowed to commit cyber crimes on these servers or these systems, and by telling us you're allowed to do it, it's no longer a cyber crime. Thanks. I'm too pretty for jail. I don't want to go to jail, so we need your permission. Once we have your permission, for an internal at least, we go on site. We set ourselves up at a desk with no prior access, except for the physical access, obviously. So we don't need any accounts or anything like that. We can take the perspective of, let's say someone broke into an office, which we've done a bunch as well. I've got lockpicks here. Lockpicks. pretty easy to break into stuff. I don't need them. I normally just trick people into letting me in. But yeah, there's someone on the network, maybe a cleaner, maybe a rogue employee. What can they do? And so we look around the network. What's available to us? What can we look at? What can we try and attack? This is what's called attack surface. We might find a vulnerability in this attack surface, and then we take advantage of that vulnerability. It's called exploitation. We exploit the vulnerability, and that might get us access to maybe a low privilege account. So not an admin, not someone with many rights, not many permissions, but it's someone's account nonetheless. Okay, we started with no access, now we've got someone's account. What can we do now? Well, with someone's account, we've got a little bit more access than we had previously. Now we look at the new attack surface that we find. Is there a vulnerability in that? Maybe we find another vulnerability that leads us to get admin privileges. And then the cycle continues. So it's this constant feedback loop of more privileges, more access, more vulnerabilities. The end goal for us here is to find as many as we can in the network and demonstrate what that actually means for your specific organization. So, you know, I got access to this server isn't really meaningful, maybe to IT, but to most people that's not meaningful. I got access to this server, which means I can legally change the name of your company because I've got the right information, the ASIC key. Yeah, that's literally happened before. And that demonstrates a real business impact. Then after that, we write up a report, has a bunch of information about the risk, the description of the vulnerability, how to remediate it, and tie it all together. So a lot of the time, combining vulnerabilities, you make them greater than the sum of their parts. So one vulnerability might just, be a medium risk, but if you combine 2 or 3 medium risks together, they can combine overall to actually be quite critical to your organization. So putting everything together in the right context is quite important. And that's what you should get from a report. Next slide. Cool. So some common misconceptions about pen testing. We get this quite a lot. A pen tester just runs tools and scripts. No. If you see someone saying that they do automated penetration testing, red flag. Don't do that. If you see someone that says that, yeah, we're just going to come in, run a scan, and that's going to be a good penetration test, no. A penetration test by definition is a manual first approach. Yes, of course, we're using tools and we're using scripts to make things more efficient for us, but it's driven by a person making on-the-fly decisions, making dynamic decisions in the environment, exactly like a human attacker would. Second one is a pen test is only for technical and IT teams. Yeah, not so much. Mike mentioned earlier that security really is a team sport. Everyone is involved in this. It's not just for technical and IT teams. And Stephen also mentioned that it's the responsibility of directors to make sure that they're securing their business. So it's actually for everyone. And I encourage everyone in a business to get involved in the penetration test as much as they want to get involved. Yeah. A pen test will cause negative impact to systems. Very rarely. It can, obviously. A good penetration tester will take a lot of effort to not cause any negative impact. So when I say, ransomware attack, things like that, we're not actually performing those things. We're just proving that we could. A good pen tester will take a lot of steps to make sure that nothing goes down. However, there's always that small chance because by nature, hacking is you're getting computers to do something that they weren't designed to do. So of course, there's always a small chance. The flip side to that is there's probably a greater chance that an attacker, real attacker, will cause more damage than any negative impact you get from a penetration test. A pen test will find all vulnerabilities. No, this is not an exact science. Although consultants do try their hardest to find as many as they can. It's not perfect. It's there is some art to this, and although most will be pretty good, the expectation shouldn't be that you're absolutely 100% secure after you do a penetration test. There is no such thing as 100% secure. A pen test just runs down a predefined checklist. This is kind of the same as just running a scanner, right? I mean, if you've got a predefined checklist, why not just write a script or a tool to run down that checklist for you? No, that's not the case. Although a good penetration tester will have a baseline checklist that they follow, the quality work here will be in choosing dynamic decisions and choosing what attacks to run based on your specific environment, your specific business case, your specific context. So that at the end of the day, it's tailored towards if an attacker was to get access to your specific organization, not a generic checklist. Yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Yeah,
That's
any
very
questions?
interesting. I have a question, unless anybody else wants to put one in the chat or unmute themselves. My question is, what's the most common type of thing that you see when you do penetration testing? Like, how are there certain things you see over and over again?
Yeah, depends on the type of penetration test, but I used the internal as an example before, so let's go with that. There are, if you have Active Directory in your network, which most organizations do, like Windows Active Directory, by default, if you installed Active Directory today, you would be vulnerable to a lot of fairly damaging things by default, even without configuring it at all. So vulnerabilities with Active Directory are really, really common. And we find them a lot, especially in organizations that do a penetration test for the first time. We get those frequently, and basically the good news is they're there by default. Sorry, the bad news is that they're there by default. The good news is that they're fairly quick fixes. So for example, NTLM relay is one we see fairly often. If you have Active Directory certificate services, there are probably vulnerabilities in there if you haven't addressed them.
Cool. There's a question from our people on the call today. What is the recommended frequency to conduct external pen tests? Is there a particular schedule you should run?
Yeah, external pen tests depends on the size of your network. Generally speaking, probably once a year, right? Once a year is a good middle ground. The thing is, even if you're not changing your environment at all, even if it's the exact same thing year on year, researchers are discovering new vulnerabilities and new attack methods to do against your systems. So the Citrix vulnerability recently is a great example of that, where you might have had your Citrix server for a long time, and then last week, surprise, there's a new highly damaging vulnerability that got discovered that suddenly everyone's jumped onto. Pen testers like me, but also, yeah, also threat actors on the internet that are just scanning for this vulnerability. So yearly and after any major change to your environment is a good probably recommendation there. If it's a very large environment, like if you're, if it's like a multinational organization, then probably it's good to come up with a plan where you're sort of doing a rolling pen test throughout the entire year, similar to how, what was it? Was it the Harbour Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge? They have to repaint that constantly, right? They move from one side of the bridge to the other side of the bridge, and by the time they finish painting that bridge, the paint at the start of the bridge is starting to fade, so they have to go back and start again. Similar to that. That's probably a good way to do it.
Good, great. Thanks for that question. Any other questions? I guess to end on a bit of a lighter note then, Alexi, in movies and things, you've probably seen a few where you see hackers doing their thing. You got any pro tips on what one looks most realistic to you?
Most realistic? Yeah, the most realistic is Mr. Robot by far, the TV show Mr. Robot. that one, you know, obviously the premise of the show is he's supposed to have like hacking superpowers almost, but technically all of those attacks can be done, probably just a really low risk that they're going to succeed. However, you know, if you want to go try and hack the FBI, which is one of the episodes, go for it. I'll deny that I told you to do that though.
They've probably got ways to check who's doing their thing anyway. So, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Just to put those details up there on the screen for you. For some reason, there we go. There's all the people who you got to listen to. Feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn or their other contact details that are provided. And yeah, if you have any other questions for individuals, then that's a way to get them answered. But appreciate your time. Thank you everyone on the panel. It's been very interesting, and hopefully we can do that again with a part 2 sometime in the not too distant future.